Hello everyone. Okay, right. This video is going to be me going through explanations for nicotine addiction. It's the third bullet point of addiction, and hopefully you've just gone through risk factors of addiction as well. Excuse me. So I've got the spec up here on addiction, and addiction's actually more tightly packed in than most people realize. If you have a look here, we've looked at risk factors, as I say, fantastic. But if you have a look here, you've got explanations for nicotine addiction, but then you kind of actually have two bullet points squeezed into one. So you're going to be, or rather we are going to be looking at explanations for nicotine addiction from a biological point of view. So neurochemistry, dopamine, glutamate, GABA, and looking how nicotine kind of interacts with all of those. But we're also going to be looking at it from a learning theory point of view with reference to cue reactivity, and that also includes social learning theory and behaviorism as well. So this is possibly likely going to be a pretty detailed bullet point, but we're just going to have to see how we go, really. So word of warning, this is quite a technical bullet point. Now, what I mean by a technical bullet point is that it has a lot of relatively complex terminology. You need to know the nitty-gritty about how biological processes work, such as, acetylcholine receptors, and that, transporting to the nucleus accumbens and all this stuff, really. So what we're looking at here is explanations for nicotine addiction. So these are the two things, as I say, we're going to be looking at, split into two schools of thoughts. Can you get nicotine addiction, smoking addiction, if you will? Can you get cigarette addictions in other ways apart from these biochemical and learning theory explanations? Of course you can. But these are the two that we are looking at. Word of warning, I know as soon as I started this video, Candy's going to turn up from work. So we'll just have to pause and pretend it doesn't happen. So my advice would be for you to watch this video just here. I'm not going to play it now because it's a roughly what do I want to say? It's 8 minutes, but I'm not going to play it now. But I would recommend that you watch this in order to get a why do they always play adverts?
Website visitors bouncing? Stress less. Convert more.
Sorry.
Try Hotjar.
No, I'm not going to.
Is HelloFresh worth the price?
No, I don't care. So we'll just pretend that doesn't happen, but watch that video, please. Watch that video and maybe start playing it now, and then maybe in a year's time you can actually get past the adverts. So this is pretty much what we are looking at. This is the reward system of reward system of the brain. This is so heavily used every single day, and it's basically the center point for addictions. This is why you get addictions biologically. You need to know all three of these, but mainly the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. The ventral tegmental area is essentially the pleasure center of the brain. It projects, it's very dopamine heavy, that area, and it projects to the nucleus accumbens for the nucleus accumbens to release all the dopamine into your prefrontal cortex, where you become aware of the pleasurable feeling. So this is the reward system. Anytime you say a joke that's funny and everyone around you laughs, anytime you score a goal, if you're playing football, or anytime that you get complimented, or anything really, anytime you take crystal meth, then there's not a normal behavior, by the way, so please don't correlate it with the ones I just said, but you get a flush of dopamine flood through this system, and it makes us feel good. It's that pleasurable feeling that we're all chasing. And really, it isn't the substance that you're addicted to if we're talking about nicotine. It's really the state that the nicotine puts you in. So what we're going to be looking at is the dopamine explanation to addiction. Now, like I say, this is really, really technical. And it's basically thought that if you ingest nicotine or if you're smoking cigarettes, that causes dopamine production and activity to spike. And that dopamine will flood through your reward system of the brain through your VTA and your nucleus accumbens. So, as I've said, the ventral tegmental area, which you absolutely need to know for this bullet point, is full of dopamine specialist neurons. Obviously, you can get serotonin specialist neurons and acetylcholine specialist neurons and stuff, but the VTA is really filled with dopamine specialist neurons, and it's basically this whole area is associated with that joyful feeling. Now, if we're applying this to nicotine, I smoked for about 2 weeks when I was about 23 years old. I found it was a great way to chat people up in a club, but I hated the actual smoking part of it. Like the chatting up of people, didn't like the smoking of people. Oh, you don't smoke people. Smoking of cigarettes, didn't like that bit. Now, when I would smoke cigarettes, I got no pleasurable feeling from it whatsoever. I got no flood of dopamine. I got certainly no sense of euphoria. But some people do, right? So you might argue here that, and this is quite an advanced AO3, that this theory only explains smoking addiction for those who have genes that make them vulnerable to that pleasurable feeling. I clearly don't have that. So the repeated usage of the system, and here's a very good term to use, repeated usage of the system can lead to desensitization of the system. The synapses become, or rather the receptors become less sensitive to the nicotine. They become less responsive to the nicotine. So in order for you to get that pleasurable feeling, you need to smoke more, for example. Apparently, my mum used to smoke 60 cigarettes a day. 60 cigarettes a day, that's just mad. But I can guarantee you 30, 40, 50, she's not getting the same feeling as she is from when she first started smoking. So I'm not going to help you go through this because I'm going to tell you what the answers are. So this is what nicotine does step by step, and it's this that you need to know for your AO1. And when I talk, you're going to see how technical this information is. This is what I mean that you need to know. So firstly, you smoke nicotine and it stimulates specific acetylcholine receptors, NACR, just for short, acetylcholine receptors, which makes you alert, improves your memory, and apparently makes you learn more, right? So nicotine has these functions on us. A little bit like caffeine, by the way. Caffeine has pretty much the same sort of effect on us. So that's the first thing that happens. It stimulates specific receptors in the brain. And this action causes a rise in the dopamine in the VTA, right? Which I've already said. The VTA is particularly populated with these dopamine-related receptors. So nicotine stimulates certain receptors, which the knock-on effect of that is that it causes dopamine to spike in the VTA. Now, after that VTA caused by nicotine is then projected to the nucleus accumbens, and that's the big producer of dopamine, really. And it's deep, as it says, the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. So you've kind of seen where it is. It's a bit more to the forward part of the brain than the VTA. So once the nucleus accumbens then floods the brain with dopamine as well, that happens very quickly, right? That, I think I read somewhere, that happens within 6 seconds. But that from smoking, from taking the drag on a cigarette to you feeling, that feeling of pleasure, euphoria, relaxation, that's a very, very quick feeling. And that comes from your nucleus accumbens. Now, eventually, the nucleus accumbens releases, and this is where it gets a bit more complex. Not only does your dopamine spike, right? Your dopamine spikes, fantastic. But not only does your dopamine spike, but also there's further endorphins that are stimulated that reduce GABA. Now, GABA calms you down. If you have too much dopamine, your body eventually will release GABA to bring that dopamine down. But something in nicotine also suppresses the amount of GABA. So there's not enough GABA for you to bring that dopamine down. So not only does your dopamine spike after you take a drag, but it stays high because you don't have that GABA to calm you down. Now, GABA is... Candy's just turned up. It's great timing. GABA is gamma aminobutyric acid. It basically calms you down. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It calms the brain down when it's excited and stimulated by dopamine. And like I say, there's something in nicotine that also suppresses GABA. So like I say, not only does your dopamine spike after taking nicotine, but it also stays high because it doesn't have that chemical to bring it down. Not only that as well, and kind of linked to this, cigarette, as it says here, cigarette smoke also contains substances that seem to block monoamine oxidase. So MAO is responsible for the breaking down of dopamine as well. So if it's blocked, dopamine will stay at higher levels. Glutamate is also the endorphins I was talking about earlier. So there's I could have admittedly put this in a bit more of a flowy presentation, but that's all you need to know for your AO1. You need to know how it triggers the VTA. That VTA then projects the nucleus accumbens to produce loads of dopamine. It does. We feel pleasure. And not only does that dopamine then spike, but you got a monoamine oxidase A that fails to break down dopamine because there's not enough of it. GABA's suppressed, and not only that, but glutamate speeds up the dopamine release even more. So in terms of research support that actually helps this, and that's all the AO1, right? That's all your AO1 that you need to know. In terms of this, you need to know D'Souza and Markel's study on rats. There are loads of other pieces of research to use, to be honest with you, but this piece of research was particularly good in that link between glutamate and GABA in nicotine addiction. So they basically blocked transmission of glutamate, which made the rats not want nicotine. So remember, I don't know if it's worth writing this down, but glutamate speeds up dopamine release, and it gets high release of glutamate when you smoke. So glutamate speeds up dopamine release. If you block glutamate, therefore you're then reducing the amount of dopamine. The rats didn't want the nicotine. The rats did not want the nicotine, and both of these also decrease when GABA is enhanced. So there's a couple of practical applications that come from this. In people who are addicted to smoking, maybe we need to somehow block the glutamate that they have, that they produce, and that's going to make them want to stop the nicotine. Maybe also increase the amount of GABA that they have. So remember, GABA is a inhibitory neurotransmitter. If we can get them a lot of anti-anxiety drugs, such as lithium, Valium, drugs that calm you down, all they do is they just increase the amount of GABA. So maybe there is a practical application there. There you go. The one last thing I do want to talk about here is it's more AO1, just a slight bit, but there's something called the nicotine regulation model. Now, I'm addicted to tea. I'm a tea addict. I'm a taddict. The first tea of the day is the best, by far. Most smokers often say the first cigarette is the best. And this is where the nicotine regulation model, which is also AO1, you can also talk about this for neurochemical explanations, but the nicotine regulation model, which may or may not be in your workbooks, but definitely write it down because it's just extra AO1, is basically saying that whilst we sleep, we're not engaging in our addiction, and our brain responds to that. So after a period without a cigarette, the down-rated nicotine receptors become upregulated. What that basically means is when you're smoking through the day, smoking, these receptors they become desensitized to the nicotine because there's so much coming through. So basically the receptors become fewer in number, but they also become more desensitized. So it takes more nicotine to make you feel good. So when I'm drinking cups of tea after cup, no, I forgot that's Bella, and just the way she sits at us. Yeah, that's also Bella there as well. But if I'm drinking cups of tea after cups of tea, they're not that good because my caffeine receptors become desensitized to the tea as I drink through the day. So basically what happens, as it says here, after a while, the down-rated nicotine receptors basically become upregulated. They basically become more sensitive, right? Now they start working again, and the brain becomes far more sensitive to the nicotine. So for reasons I don't think many of us really understand, but this now high sensitivity to dopamine produces feelings of anxiety, agitation, and restlessness. You wake up, I need a cup of tea, I need a cigarette, I need this, and I feel like, and we don't like this feeling. It makes me uncomfortable, but I don't like leaving the house without having a cup of tea. It's unpleasant, it's anxiety producing, I get agitated, I'm a bit restless, I don't feel like my day has started. So these horrible feelings, and this is why, by the way, addictions are so difficult to beat. If I don't have a cup of tea within the first hour, I get really irritated. I get a bit snappy, not very happy. All of this unpleasantness can be fixed instantly by me having the thing that I love the most, apart from candy and my cat and whatever, but tea. Smokers are often the same. Smokers will wake up and they will feel irritated, they'll feel restless, and it can be stopped by having the thing they love the most. And not only that, but that first cigarette of the day is by far the best. The smoker can very quickly remove these unpleasant symptoms by smoking a cigarette, releasing nicotine, and basically most smokers will tell you that the first cigarette of the day is the most pleasurable. So basically the main thing I want you to take away from nicotine regulation model is that you go for a period of time. When you sleep, basically, you go for a period of time where you don't have your addicted substance. Your brain becomes more sensitive to it, which a consequence of that is it makes you irritable. So when you wake up and then have that cigarette, it not only feels amazing, but it also gets rid of the unpleasantness of you waking up and your brain being more sensitive and not having had the cigarette. So nicotine regulation model, you might want to watch you might want to watch the whole of this video so far once more or twice more, because it is quite complex. It is, I hope you can see what I mean by it is very technical. Now, in terms of AO1 so far, you could either go for that dopamine reaction to nicotine, ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens. You could either go for the nicotine regulation model, or I would advise maybe going for both. They're two kind of separate theories arguing kind of about the same thing. Now, in terms of evaluations, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but not everybody becomes addicted to smoking when they try it. So there must be other factors involved here. Therefore, this theory is low in explanatory power. It can only be counted as a partial explanation, and maybe for it to be considered a more thorough explanation, it needs to include some sort of genetic component to this theory that says that people with certain genes will feel this pleasure, whereas if you don't have the gene, then you won't get the pleasure. Currently, this theory, this is a great evaluation, by the way, if I do say so myself. This theory is nomothetic. It's saying that everyone who smokes will feel this pleasure. Everyone who smokes will have their VTA activate their nucleus accumbens and release loads of dopamine into their prefrontal cortex, and therefore they feel pleasure. But I'm not being funny, and I speak from experience, that is bullshit, basically. So this theory needs, as part of your evaluation, you would say, this theory needs a more thorough understanding about why individual differences exist in the effects that nicotine has on us. Now, the counter to this argument is basically what I've just said. There you go. There is explanations that genetic vulnerabilities expose some individuals, to higher feelings of pleasure in these substances. If I were to give every one of my students in my class, for a laugh, 5 cigarettes and give them 15 minutes to smoke it, some of them will love it, some of them will hate it, because some of them have the genes that allow them to feel pleasure for smoking, whereas others don't. But this theory doesn't take that into account, and therefore it is, in my opinion, and this is a very technical word, shit. It's obviously reductionist as well, right? What do we mean by this? Oh, God, this really annoys me. But what do we mean by this? You're taking a complex theory, a complex behavior, addiction in this case, and reducing it down to being caused by one single thing. And you're ignoring other potential factors, and therefore your theory is parochial. If you're going to elaborate on why something is reductionist, you have to say that it is narrow-minded, it's parochial in this case. Okay, model answer. I'm just going to go through this quite quickly because I want to get onto the other one, the other theory. But in this case, here's my point. Biological approach to nicotine is flawed due to the logical assumption that this reaction does not take place for everybody. We're talking about nicotine's impact on dopamine here. My evidence is not a research piece of evidence, but it does make sense. For example, it's logical to suggest that not all individuals will feel smoking as a pleasurable act, nor will they repeat the action of smoking. And to elaborate, therefore, this then means that theory does not explain smoking for everyone, reducing its explanatory power. It may well be that a genetic component needs to be added to the theory to further explain these individual differences, and therefore the theory needs to be further adapted to better explain why smoking is only addictive for certain individuals. That's an okay model point. If that is an oxymoron, I don't know, but it will do. Now, one thing I do want my students to do, I'm just going to go back to that point, is I would like you need to make your AO3s flow. Don't do them as like 3 or 4 block paragraphs that are completely unrelated to each other. So just as a practice, start making your AO3s flow a little bit more. So I've got a good point here, an okay point here about how it doesn't explain it for everybody. But then have a look at the first sentence going into it. However, despite these issues in explaining smoking for everyone, there is research support. So just try and make your points flow a little bit more. It will make your AO3 so much better, right? It's an essay. The paragraphs should be linked to each other. I'm not going to go through this model Peel because you have it there, but this is a typical question that comes up. Describe how brain neurochemistry is involved in nicotine addiction. 6 marks, pure AO1. You're looking at writing 8 separate elements to this. So you need to know nicotine regulation model, you need to know nicotine's effect upon dopamine, and you need to use, importantly, all of these terms, and you need to understand them, right? So unfortunately, you're just going to have to get your head around how this actually works. Okay, there is... I'm just going to pause 2 seconds. Turns out Candy's not home. I was making that up, apparently. So I'm all alone. Moving on. If I ask you who this is, you will respond with Pete Doherty. You won't tell me you've never heard of him. You won't tell me that you've never heard of the Libertines. And I won't, as a result, hate your generation. This is Pete Doherty. He is, in my opinion, one of the greatest songwriters of my generation, certainly. He sings in a band called the Libertines, and he wrote what is, in my opinion, one of the best songs I've written of all time, Music When the Lights Go Out. Thank me later if you like your indie. Although if you like your indie, you should know it already, and you should be ashamed if you don't know it. why is he on a slide for learning theory? Because in many ways he is a role model to many people. Yet he was addicted to all sorts of stuff, but he obviously smokes as well. So here we're going to be looking at the learning theory as applied to smoking behavior. Now you've looked at the learning theory already, right? You know it. We looked at it for first year. We looked at it for phobias. We looked at it for learning approaches in approaches. So you know all of it already. You just need to apply it in this case to addiction, and it's relatively straightforward. So social learning theory is pretty easy. You could look at one thing I don't include here is vicarious reinforcement. You're seeing on a stage, Pete Doherty, your role model, for example, he's got a cigarette in his mouth. You've got thousands of people cheering his name, and you're thinking, yeah. Okay, you're a cool bastard, and that might be a reason why you smoke. It's not just celebrity role models here. We're mainly talking about familial or friend ones. So obviously, this has face validity. Smokers learn their behavior of role models who they may vicariously witness for being praised or rewarded for their behavior, and that you also accept that peer influence comes in here as well. Your friends can be your role model. Now, I did say as a task here to recap the mediational processes, but I'm going to go through those right now. So you've got 4 mediational processes, and hopefully you should know them. The first one is attention. Now, remember what mediational processes are. These 4 mediational processes determine the extent to which a person will see the behavior, as in smoking, role model smoking, and then copy the behavior. Social learning theory is a bit more complex than just behaviorism and operant conditioning, classical conditioning. Behaviorism is like you see, you do. It's literally that. You see, and without thinking, you do. But mediational processes think that's a crock of rubbish. I've swore too much already. They say you see something, you mediate on it, you process it, and then maybe you will copy. So the 4 I'm about to go through are mediational processes, and they determine the extent to which someone will actually copy the behavior. So the first one is attention. You actually need to pay attention to the role model. How do they hold the cigarette, for example? How many do they smoke during the day? When do they smoke in the day? Because they're telling you what you should do. They're telling you how you should hold the cigarette. They're telling you what brand to smoke. They're telling you, I know they're not directly telling you, but their role modeled behavior is basically saying, this is what I do and this is what I think you should do. Where do they get them from? When do they smoke? Do they smoke after stressful events, for example? And you have to be paying attention. In order to copy them, you have to actually be paying attention to them. And the same applies for retention. You cannot remember, you need to remember all of that. You need to remember how much they smoke. You need to remember where did they get them from. You cannot copy what you cannot remember. And that just makes logical sense. The third one is about replication. Can you copy them? It's not about paying attention all the time. It's not about can you remember. It's can you physically copy them? So the first thing is, if you have asthma, probably not. Probably not. If you don't like the smell of smoke, then you're not going to be able to replicate them because you hate the smell of smoke. But generally speaking, smoking is not difficult. I play tennis quite a lot. Roger Federer is a role model for me growing up. I've played a lot of tennis. I can't physically copy what he does, right? And therefore, I'm probably not going to be able to copy him. And lastly, motivation. You have to actually want to copy the role model. If you don't want to copy the role model, if your mum or dad get lung cancer, for example, God forbid, but if they got lung cancer, you're probably not going to want to copy them. However, if you want to be like your role model, then obviously that's all the motivation that you have. So not only, by the way, do you need to know this, you need to be ready to apply it as well. So a piece of research here, Ennett et al. 2010 basically found that, and I like, the reason why I put this in here is because I like this quote. The family and peer context were primarily implicated in someone then smoking. So Enna et al. Is good evidence that actually peers and family are primary drivers of why people actually smoke, because people copy them. And that's when you learn a lot of your behaviors. Importantly as well, don't forget, peer influence at the age of 18 and family influence from the age of 7 to 12, it's really high. It's really high. And that is when most people actually start smoking. That latter one, by the way, is probably 11 or 12. A lot of people start smoking. Now, that's one theory, and you can go for that. That will get you credit. There is another theory you need to know about here as well, and it's the idea about cue reactivity. Cue reactivity is, I've got a thing on the side, so we'll just ignore that. But wait, sorry. I could have swore it was on the side. Cue reactivity. On the right-hand side here, cue reactivity is a type of learned response which is observed in individuals with an addiction and involves significant physiological and subjective reactions to presentations of drug-related stimuli. So basically, if I show you a cigarette branding and you have associated that cigarette branding, that packaging, for example, like this, if I show you this behind and you didn't want a cigarette, for example, you're perfectly fine. You go to a shop, all these cigarettes are laid out behind the till like they used to be, and you see all this attractive branding. And every time, by the way, you're smoking, maybe you're looking at the cigarette pack, you very quickly associate that cigarette pack with pleasure, right? The same way, by the way, if I'm at the pub quite a lot of the time and I've got my beer in one hand and I've got a cigarette in another and I'm constantly smoking doing that, right? If I throw the cigarette away and just have this in my hand, it will feel weird not to have cigarette there. So that's cue reactivity. This is the cue, and the reactivity is me wanting to have a cigarette to smoke, for example. So, and Candy used to do this all the time, is when she'd have a pint in her hand, she always wanted to have a vape in her hand. She always wanted. Now, when she stopped vaping and carried on drinking, whenever she drunk, that triggered off her want to vape. So that is essentially cue reactivity. Now, I don't know what this is. I don't know if there's anything else here. So I've mentioned a lot of this, going outside of a pub and seeing people smoking, or getting used to slowly having a pint in one hand and a cigarette in another. So essentially, cue reactivity is quite important. I've done these slides in completely the wrong way. I've got a piece of research here. Calvert showed those cigarette packets to smokers, just the branding, just Marlboro or Pall Mall and all these cigarette brands, and looked at their brains, and they had strong reactions in the ventral striatum, which is basically a pleasure part of the brain. Just seeing the branding of the cigarette package was enough for the brain to start feeling pleasure, or then craving pleasure in this case. Now, there's a ton of practical applications to do with this. If this piece of research tells us that branding, or putting, let's look at alcohol, for example, bottles of beer along a shelf, that is enough to trigger off our craving in our ventral striatum. And therefore, in terms of nicotine, we need to hide from sight. We need to hide it. And that is the laws that have been coming in over the last 10 years, is all these anti-nicotine, anti-cigarette laws. They've been coming because of this piece of research. Now, that's going to have a huge economic benefit, because if we can stop people smoking by hiding them from people, essentially, people aren't going to get the lung cancers, people aren't going to get the emphysemas, people aren't going to get the bronchitis cases that are linked to smoking. So there's huge impact here. Lastly, as well, we've looked at social learning theory, we've looked at cue reactivity. We also need to look at the very basic behaviorism. Not being able to smoke can make people irritated, can piss people off. Smoking immediately takes away that unpleasant feeling. And therefore, smoking is basically negatively reinforcing, oh, if I smoke, I can get rid of those horrible feelings. Negative reinforcement. There's also then people like phobias. People then maintain that habit to avoid withdrawal symptoms. But obviously, smoking is also positively reinforcing for a lot of people. Smoking is pleasurable to some people, therefore they do it again. Thorndike's law of effect. So there's a lot there to unpack, to be perfectly honest with you. In terms of evaluations, a key evaluation here is that this is sound psychological theory. Behaviorism is as close to fact as a theory can get. This is how we learn. We do learn through role models. We do learn through associations. So many pieces of research have found this. It's pretty much a fact. So it makes sense. It has face validity to apply this onto smoking. Look, it just makes sense, doesn't it? It does. It may not be the whole thing, but it just makes sense. There are a lot of practical applications that result from this, particularly cue reactivity, by the way. So in your workbooks, make sure you've got down this fact of if we can see that branding of alcohol or branding of, fancy, colourful cigarette packages make people want cigarettes, then what we're going to do, we can make them all black. We can have all messages on them like "you're going to die" and just pictures of lungs and teeth and, I don't know, sexual organs or whatever. No, I don't know where that came from. But horrible pictures, put them on the cigarette packages is hopefully going to put people off. And then finally, it's clearly environmentally determined. And what I have here is a point on that environmental determinism. So you might want to pause, and that's how you would have a look on determinism. By the way, if you're ever going to go for determinism, and I know I don't actually say the word determinism here, it's quite bad. I say there's a lack of free will, but you want to talk about how it's going to be socially sensitive. So there's quite a lot here. That's a long ass video. You've got the biological things you need to talk about, right? So make sure you know those and the evaluations. But you've also got social learning theory, you've also got cue reactivity, and you've also got behaviorist models of nicotine addiction as well. With the final question, that is everything. Quite a long, not going to lie, quite a long video, but trust me, this is a hefty bullet point. Could easily get a 16 marker in this. So you probably do need to be prepped for that. As always, hope it was useful. Peace out.